The long 19th century ended with a world war, but without a world revolution. For many German revolutionaries, the old world had been destroyed, but the new one refused to materialize. In the newly founded Weimar Republic that came out of the ashes of the war, there was a widespread apocalyptic mood among Marxists and other intellectual groups. It was within this charged intellectual climate that the young Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno began his philosophical studies. Although Adorno saw the dialectical theories of Hegel and Marx as the pinnacle of philosophy, he did not buy the idea that history followed a predetermined path that could not fail. Still, he believed that the lost sense of wholeness and the major conflicts of the Weimar Republic were symptoms of the end of the bourgeois era, and he viewed the revolution of the working class as both necessary and desirable. But instead of ushering in a new reconciliatory age, history took a different course and led directly into Auschwitz. Europe was swept by a new form of barbarity, and Adorno found himself in a world divided into Stalinism, fascism, and late-stage capitalism. Many Marxists took Marx's thesis that the world needs to be changed, not only interpreted, as a call to stop philosophizing and join the revolutionaries instead. For Adorno, however, the failure of the world revolution made any conceivable and meaningful project of improving the world impossible. The task was once again to interpret. The philosophers had to return from the barricades to the ivory tower and contemplate the failure of the proletariat to achieve revolutionary consciousness. Philosophy that once seemed outdated is kept alive because the moment of its realization was missed. It survives as critical dialectics. Critical dialectics is the last philosophy. It is the vengeful ghost of philosophy that has to complete its final task so that it may die properly. After the failure of the revolution, we remain trapped at the current stage of history. Everywhere we look, social conditions cry out for their own overcoming, yet their inner dynamic has come to a halt. Bourgeois society, in its final phase, survives by producing static, authoritarian forms of domination to suppress this dynamic. Adorno calls this state the administered world, that is embedded in a total nexus of deception. The social psychologist Leon Festinger observed that apocalypticism sometimes emerges in response to failed prophecies. Building on this, the philosopher of religion Jakob Taubes added that Gnosticism can be a response to a failed apocalypse. Gnosticism is a collective term for various religious movements that emerged in the Mediterranean region during the first centuries after Christ. One of their key characteristics is the separation of God from the Creator. The demiurge, the creator of this world, is often portrayed by Gnostics as a flawed being. He is malicious, or at least ignorant. The world he has created is fundamentally evil, a prison for the soul, while the true God becomes a deus absconditus, an absent God. Salvation from this world is possible for the soul only through esoteric knowledge, so-called gnosis. It is important to clarify that this is not an attempt to frame Adorno's philosophy simply as a revival of ancient Gnosticism. In 20th century Germany, Gnosticism became the subject of unusually intensive and varied research that was often used to make sense of the crisis of meaning surrounding the two world wars. And many philosophies, including Marxism, have been accused of merely being a revival of Gnosticism to discredit them. There is a kind of Catholic reflex to reduce unfamiliar and original ideas to known heresies. Not to mention that these accusations were based on doubtful historical research on actual ancient Gnosticism. Instead of dismissing Adorno's philosophy as a rebirth of Gnosticism, I want to offer a brief summary and a critique of his negative dialectics, and thereby explore some of the Gnostic motives in his philosophy. Motives that also appear across a range of cultural forms, from poetry and novels to films like The Man Who Fell to Earth from 1976. In that Gnostic-inspired film, David Bowie portrays an empathetic and innocent alien who becomes stranded on Earth. His original mission fails when he is met with militarism, greed, and malicious suspicion. Depressed and desperate, he becomes ensnared in a world of consumption. As he absorbs capitalist mass culture, he loses his identity. Only his music preserves the faint memory that this world is not his true home, and that there is more beyond it. He hopes that, broadcast through radio waves, his enigmatic songs might one day reach his true home. According to the theologian Barbara Arland, Gnosis is not rooted solely in existential nihilism. Gnostics were often people capable of profound feelings of joy, but they contrasted memories of happiness, probably often from one's childhood, with the world's pervasive corruption, and were unable to locate them within it. The joy had to be projected into a distant beyond. However, unlike Gnosticism, critical dialectics is a post-metaphysical philosophy and offers no possibility of projecting memories of happiness into a transcendent beyond. At the same time, these memories cannot be affirmed as part of the administered world either. Instead, they persist in a censored realm of thought and can only be articulated indirectly through negations, a technique borrowed from negative theology. Negative or apophatic theology is a theological approach to speak about God by stating what he is not. For Adorno, this method offers a way of approaching the non-identical and its utopian moment without defining it, and this protects the utopian moment from being absorbed by the administered world. Critical dialectics is a form of critique of ideology, but every critique of ideology presupposes a hidden truth. Just as every theory of alienation assumes an original closeness, every theory of reification a living current, and every theory of repression a freedom that has been suppressed. Yet the counterpart is subject to aniconism, a ban on images. For instance, according to Adorno, the freedom of philosophy lies solely in exposing and portraying its own unfreedom. And the truth that negative dialectics possesses is not something positive, but merely the knowledge of society's fundamental falsehood. Never must critical dialectics refer to a positive alternative. The term positive is frequently used by Adorno pejoratively as it carries a dual meaning, both as that which already exists and that which has to be affirmed. However, since everything that exists shouldn't, affirmation represents the ultimate sin of our time. The falsity of the world cannot be overcome by adding another positive to it. The Midas touch of the positive transforms unrealized utopian elements into corporately mandated happiness and feel-good advertising. The abstract utopian elements that promise a better world and could transcend the administered society harden in their realization, becoming pillars of the social order. The visible disaster of the first nature was insignificant in comparison with the second, social one, which defies human imagination as it distills a real hell from human evil. The administered society as a whole is the key for the understanding of all individual processes. Without an awareness of the whole, our view of the particular cannot penetrate to the true nature of things. We remain stuck on the ideological surface. Yet this totality is never empirically given like other material phenomena. It can only be experienced. According to Adorno, everyone encounters the pressure and lack of freedom of being forced into a social role, especially in the world of labor. Critical dialectics reveals the unity of the whole as the ubiquitous coercive force to which human beings are subjected. It is, in essence, the ontology of the false world. The non-identical is for Adorno the remainder, the singular and particular which cannot be fully captured by the totality. I will try to give a brief explanation of this difficult concept as far as I understand it. Elements are brought under a concept by abstracting their identical features. For example, these three elements are subsumed under the concept A through the shared feature small a. Adorno is likely not concerned here with everyday concepts like dog or bicycle, but rather with the prominent philosophical categories such as nature, rights, or subject. The concept thus becomes the unity of elements sharing the same defining feature. However, the elements always exceed the concept, as they possess more features than the concept includes. Even if those other features are also brought under concepts, something always remains, the non-identical. The non-identical also includes those unique combinations of features that are not captured by the concept. It is precisely this non-identical that drives the development of concepts forward. For Adorno, concepts are always historical and dynamic. Only bourgeois thinking seeks to fix them once and for all, thereby excluding the non-identical. The non-identity of the particulars signal defiance, transitoriness, and utopia. At the same time, a concept is always more than just the sum of its elements. For example, the concept of freedom, according to Adorno, does not merely encompass the individuals who happen to be free under a given constitution, it also points beyond them in a normative sense. This non-identical relation, in which concept and elements are always more and less than one another, is the contradiction in reality to which dialectics responds. It is the moment of reality that carries the possibility of development within it. Yet this contradiction is unconscious and concealed. It must be uncovered by critique. The problem is obvious. The non-identical is itself a concept that designates everything that is not conceptualized. Thinking is not possible without concepts, even critical thinking. That is why Adorno relies on a dialectical logic that draws on the dynamic and non-identical relation between elements and concept to approach this counter-concept of the non-identical. On the other hand, positive, non-dialectical thinking of bourgeois philosophers is merely mirroring the false world. Their philosophical systems tried to eradicate the non-identical remainder. Even the dialectical system of Hegel ultimately falls back to the principle of identity. However, non-dialectical bourgeois thinking makes matters even worse, since it can only conceive of things that do not conform to the principle of identity as a contradiction. And in non-dialectical logic, contradictions are errors that need to be eradicated. The logical thinking of most people is corrupted by the principle of identity and therefore complicit with the evils in the world. All the agents of late-stage capitalism and state socialism deprive the individuals of their ability to say no. However, although identity thinking marginalizes, conceals, and even wants to destroy the non-identical, it can never achieve it, because any thinking is dependent on its existence. If the non-identical would be eradicated, all thinking would freeze into an eternal image. Pure identity means death. This is maybe better understood when we look at Adorno's Marxist critique of society, which mirrors his critical epistemology. The fully administered society renders everything identical through the rule of the exchange principle, while the total nexus of deception conceals the contradictory nature of reality. The part of a product that cannot be subsumed under exchange value falls out as the non-identical. In this case, it's quality or use value. And yet, if one manages to see through the fog of ideology, use value appears as a necessary, irrational, and non-identical element upon which exchange itself is ultimately based. Likewise, the vampiric capitalists need the living labor of the proletariat, even though they try to rid themselves of this variable by replacing the living labor of the workers with dead labor in the form of machines. However, surplus value can only be generated by living labor, and its absence would mean the end of capitalism. The undead need to feast on the living, otherwise they would die for good. The force of the existing order erects the facades against which consciousness collides. It must strive to break through them. Adorno developed several methods to break through the nexus of deception. I will just present two of them. One is the hyperbole. Critical dialectics relies on exaggeration and takes arguments to extremes in order to push concepts further and free them from their congealment. Only exaggerated thoughts can penetrate the omnipresent ideology. Exaggerations such as the state brings order, trade brings peace, individualism brings freedom, community brings security, and so on, have always existed in philosophy. A critical mind is skeptical of these exaggerations. Adorno's critical theory, on the other hand, goes one step further and combats the exaggerations with inverted exaggerations. For example, while ancient philosophers promised that anyone who thinks philosophically can become a cosmopolitan, that is, be at home everywhere, Adorno's philosophy promotes the realization that no one can ever be at home in this world. Another technique is looking at the non-identity between psychological intent and the concrete artwork. This is the case, for example, when a work of art proves to be more intelligent than its creator, or when an artwork reveals more to a critic than intended by the artist. Likewise, truth cannot be found in the systems of the great philosophers, but rather in the gaps and breaks in their systems, in their Freudian slips and inconsistencies. Most works grounded in critical dialectics are filled with attacks on so-called ordinary or bourgeois thinking. Caricatures of non-dialectical thinking are often drawn and then dismissively brushed aside. This can be quite off-putting to readers who are not already convinced that dialectics is superior to all other forms of thought. However, the resentment is easy to understand. Since the world has broken its promise and the post-capitalist age has not arrived, philosophy could not find a worthy conclusion in its actualization. According to Adorno, the critical theorist follows the dialectical logic of the objects themselves without imposing a rigid framework. He approaches them like a detective who asks the right questions and then simply lets the suspect speak until he inevitably reveals himself. However, the verdict is always already decided, and no methodological framework could be as suffocating as the concept of the administered world. The moment when the suspect reveals his entanglement in the totality is always a moment of relief for the critic and offers a renewed sense of orientation within the world. Everything remains as it was. The evil whole is still where he last saw it. For Adorno, the idea that things can offer an apologia for themselves is absurd, since any attempt to defend reality merely proves that one has not yet broken through the facade. To defend is to conceal. The suchness of society contains only internal necessities. To seek an explanation in some external necessity, whether coincidence, materiality, incapacity, or a non-social force, is always already an act of reification. According to Adorno, the negative in negative dialectics should serve as a counterforce to ossified patterns of thought. Yet few things are as ossifying as the key concepts of the last philosophy, such as the total nexus of deception, the all-dominating principle of exchange, and the helpless non-identical. The result is a Gnostic battle between affirmative thinking, which confirms the administered world, and negative thinking, which seeks to transcend it through critique. The rudiments of a pluralistic ontology are visible in Adorno's open dialectic. Yet, in the end, the dark hole swallows everything. Adorno's concept of totality is not empirically verifiable, and yet it is treated as the most real thing of all. The rhetorically invoked, ubiquitous totality is so powerful that it predetermines the results of any analysis. It doesn't take much to see that this is bad science. Furthermore, critical dialectics reduces every relation to identity and contradiction. Adorno would probably argue that it is actually the administered world that reduces everything to identity, and that his philosophy is the adequate tool to describe its actual effects that lie behind the ideological fog. However, this reductionism is ultimately more obscuring than illuminating. These problems carry over into Adorno's sociology. Negative dialectics cannot provide a good foundation for critical sociology. Despite all his critique of identity thinking, it is precisely Adorno's sociology that repeatedly identifies only one thing. Even in concrete sociological analysis, the theme remains the same, which ridicules any sincere attempt of empirical research. Just as the seraphim circling the throne of God eternally repeat the same phrase, Critical sociologists circle the social totality and endlessly proclaim ideology. Adorno's Gnostic-inspired Freudo-Marxism remains a somber work of art and a thought-provoking philosophical endeavor. However, his monothematic dialectical theory and critical sociology lead into an impasse, and the generations of critical theory that followed Adorno had to deviate from his theory in essential points in order to escape the dead end of the last philosophy.